Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's user share. We are welcoming CTP Thorsten Rood back to our webinar stage. He's done a couple of webinars with us in the past, and I'm happy to have him back with us today. Going to be talking about what he calls the elephant in the room. So WhatsApp, business contacts, data privacy, and Citrix Endpoint management. So we're going to get into all of that and how it relates to GDPR. But before I turn things over to him to get us started, just want to remind you of how our format is going to flow today. Thorsten's going to give us a presentation, and he also has a demo for us. As he's doing that, when you have questions, please type those into the question panel. We're going to save all of the questions for the end of the presentation after the demo, so don't worry, we will get to all of your questions, but I do want you to type them in as you have them. And just a note that our presentation today is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording via email afterwards, probably sometime tomorrow. So with that, I will hand things over to Thorsten to get us started. I know he has a question for all of you to get started with. He has a quick poll, so I'm going to launch that while he takes it away.
Okay, so welcome from my end as well. Thanks for the intro. You all should now having on screen a quick wake-up call for all you guys, because I would like to get a certain impression about the relevance, what I try to do and pitch for you today. So we have at least 3 choices. I didn't put a 4th one in. I don't know if there actually is a 4th one. At least these 3 ones, pick the best one that fits to you. The first option is saying, hey, I have European customers that I work with, but my company is completely located outside the European continent space. So at least legally, I'm not a European business. Second question is, I have European data in terms of processing needs. And of course, I have at least one city that falls on the European side of the world. And the last one is, I'm kind of the lazy guy on the world. I'm happy with all these things because I don't have to care about that at all. So please pick your choice. That we get a certain impression on what we have today. I would like to do some comments on that. I don't know if we have progress on that. How many of you have already voted? I think we just close that down and see the numbers. Here we go. Okay, that's may happening. It's okay for me. It's interesting. So maybe you hear something new, because if you fall in the 3rd category, it's more like awareness, because it may not affect you directly. On the first ones, there is I would say, dual-fold perspective, because you are affected by everything I would go through, but legally it may be hard to pursue you for anything that you do wrong with that. On the middle tier, you are completely screwed, as I am myself, because I am obviously working in the European space with European customers, and we have our offices here. So if everything goes wrong with us and our business, we are affected by everything that happens. So with that, I would take that away with the slides and just start with a small recap, because actually it wasn't that new. I did that session a while ago, so it's not the first time to run this through. Maybe it's the last time, but at least it is still relevant, because the industry and the legal boundaries haven't changed that much. There was something last year that made a difference to the overall readiness, so to say, what the products actually can deliver in direct relationship to what the legal requirements are. I did some small blogs around that, but I also learned that regardless of the blogging thing, that the number of documents and white papers and stuff that you can get around this problem are not that much, I would say, accurate. They are not complete. There's not one place where you can go one-stop shopping and get the full information. And so I decided that I just do a complete session about that. And what I've brought to you guys today is 4 different chapters. I would like to speak a bit about my personal mobile challenges, and that means my challenges means my customers' challenge, because I'm earning a business around mobility projects and mobility needs. The second chapter is about what the industry can provide you today out of the box. The 3rd one is my personal favorite, because I'm not running around just anyhow. I really need to drive around, which makes a huge difference if you want to bring together the world of driving and the world of electronics. And the fourth thing is something that it comes direct from my heart because it deals with general security requirements when dealing with our little guy called ActiveSync, which is obviously part of the gameplay anyway. With that, starting a little differentiation, because of timing, we need to focus on this nice guy called Apple only. I would completely run out of time if I do all the others in behind. So it's not a, well, I'm not saying I dislike Android, but actually I don't have the time to go through it today. And it's actually also different if you look into the detail of how iOS behaves technology-wise in that world, in direct comparison to what you can do with Android and vice versa. So we don't have a full-blown any smartphone session today. We just have an iOS one, and that really takes us 40 minutes or more. So that's just reducing the complexity out of the game. First, getting an idea what I want to talk through. So we need to set a certain baseline, so to say, a common use case. If everybody looks at its own habits and what his daily interactivity on a smartphone that has both a business use case and obviously a personal perspective, then these guys come together. That's the reason why I invited for that. It's the guy called WhatsApp or others. So WhatsApp actually is just a placeholder, but it's one of the most relevant ones, obviously. And that goes in direct relationship with the email and collaboration tools that you have on your smartphone. Obviously, that is not the complete picture. It's about the context. And I would like to get into detail in regards to the context because they fall under something that is directly covered by the GDPR. And of course, it's not only that little picture. If you really go mobile, it means you're driving around with your stuff. And if you have these puzzle pieces on screen, it's just given fact that even if you would like to exclude certain things from that circle, it is just fact that you have the, I would say, the discrepancy or the competition between a personal usage and a business usage per se. And what's also interesting to see that those personal and social things also have become business relevant. It's not only that you say it's my WhatsApp and stuff like that, and social engagement is just me. I would say pretty much every customer and every corporation today has some sort of social initiative underway. So WhatsApp also is a business application anyway. And if you have that all side by side, it's that we need to face the fact that we have these communication needs. The habits have changed in comparison to like saying 5 years ago or so. And so we have that all side by side. And we need to learn how to deal with that. And dealing with that means the GDPR is the important legal boundary that I am facing practically on a daily perspective. I said in the intro, I'm earning money with giving customers mobile solutions, which essentially means whatever I consult them and whatever I deploy and design for those customers has to fit into legal boundaries, as otherwise it is likely I'm not getting paid. And even if you're not doing consultancy business around mobility and just run IT for your own corporation, it still doesn't make a difference because at least you need to ask your owners how much willingness there is to take the risk of not adhering to existing laws. So what's in that? The GDPR was built, and that's really the 10,000 feet summary quick run through. It is a legal framework that protects personal identifiable information. So something that comes from personas, and that is something that allows you to perfectly track or distinguish one individual versus another. So it's name and numbers and really the small things that allow you linking something to a person. And any organization, regardless if they are commercial or nonprofit, they have to apply to these rules if they serve EU data subjects. And that means they need to make sure that whatever they process in terms of those data subjects is not kept longer than necessary, and it's just used for the purpose of what it's meant to be collected and nothing else. And if they use secondary processing, like other parties that help them on processing their business case and where data has to be transferred over to another organization, those legal boundaries make it over to the next party. So it's a complete chain where everybody has to adhere to the law. If you give something over to another guy, you need to personally make sure that the boundaries are being respected. The only difference is that all this has been in place a while ago, but just by May 2018, the difference was that when now something goes wrong with that, the fines were active. So the leisure boundary was in place for a way longer time, but by May last year, it is now getting costly to you guys if you get caught with something that goes wrong. Obviously, I'm not the guy trying to tell you that you will have a fine of 20 million or 4% worldwide annual turnover if something goes wrong with WhatsApp, but the general principle still applies. So WhatsApp is a candidate that falls into that. And the reason why WhatsApp falls into that is this one. The WhatsApp application and the organization behind is not compliant to what the law requires, because what WhatsApp does, once you open the app, it does exactly that where that community social framework was being built for. It tries to synchronize all its participants so that they can easily collaborate. That means they pick your whole address book and do a full upload to their servers to make it easier for the users of that framework to talk to each other and to identify themselves and each other. And they just give that little opt-in message, which doesn't perfectly disclose what's going on in the background. And that also means, from a leisure perspective, you now opt in into a data transmission of everybody, which means even those people that are not willing to be part of that upload will make their way on those external servers for data processing. So technically and legally, you would first have to ask everybody of your saved contacts, if it is a European candidate, that they opt in and are willing to be sent to WhatsApp or other of these guys, which is hard. Technically, it's undoable. So you logically would have to forbid answering that question that WhatsApp gives you in the start with a yes, or maybe not using the stuff at all. But that is not the reality how the app is used, right? So you need to make sure that this thing that just happens doesn't cause you a problem. So the mission is called, how do we find ways to have WhatsApp side by side on my smartphone with loaded contacts of European data subjects without violating the law? And well, that's hard, right? And nobody actually brings that up in that little consent screen. It's just a yes/no question. I would say 100% of the users just say yes, and then everything's in danger and no pressure. And WhatsApp is not the only one. Just to be fair with that, if you're favoring Telegram or other applications, they pretty much have similar behavior if they create a community in behind. So it's not only this one, it's just the most relevant guy that everybody knows. And I'm not even not saying try to fight the app, it's just there. We need to find ways, which may be organizational, logistic wise, or technically, to find ways to be compliant. So compliance is a hard thing. If you want to be compliant to any rule, you always have two choices. You can do a soft or a hard enforcement. The soft one means you write something down in terms of the usability rights, a contract with your employees, so a terms of use policy and whatever stuff, and have that underwritten. That's good. The other thing could be that you do something on the technical tier and try to make sure that even people that don't want to follow these rules have no way of escaping certain boundaries. So it could be an either or question. So it's a organizational thing and a technical perspective that makes it even better. And now you logically would say, I could just do the easiest way that I find through the problem. Unfortunately, if you take the GDPR in direct view, what's written down there from a law perspective, it's saying it needs both technical and organizational measures. So it's not an either or, it's more an and thing that you need to take care of. And that's important, that it's not only something that a logical consent is okay, you also need to make sure that technology follows that down, which makes it even more complex. So the compliance thing requires to think about the ownership of devices, and also need to think about the enforcement options that you have for doing certain things to your users' devices, which means we have the ongoing and every day's interesting discussion about if BYO is a strategy that you would like to pursue, or if you more would like be in a situation where you hand out corporately owned asset to your users and allow a certain personal coverage depending on what you want to allow there, or if you're going full corporate. So that's an ongoing discussion, what's the best choice there. And depending on the technical organizational choice of BYO or non-BYO, you have certain limitations of what you then can do with the device. Because if it's just a BYO, an asset that you don't own, it is hard to enforce MDM technology on certain settings, because the users will not like getting kind of controlled with something that they don't understand. Even if you are not necessarily want to do something bad to them, they will just refuse to be part of such a technical restriction framework, just to be more in compliance. So that's a trade-off, right? So you have an either or, and if MDM is your only way to get into a certain scenario and deploy a certain solution, some of the asset strategies that may be relevant or may have been relevant over a certain time frame are no longer applicable. That's just interesting to remember that somehow, and occasionally if you rethink about your strategy. So that's just a starting point. So the industry has changed their products to allow you going in a more compliant world. And the most interesting change that the industry has made is they try to bring us sandboxing our data. Sandboxing, you may call that shielding, you may call that kind of a virtualization for the data layer. I would prefer the sandboxing terminology. And the idea is to do something that is not directly using the native email client any longer, so that you can escape certain things that you cannot control, because the native client comes from the OS. And so that means, as the OS is owned by Apple, or that's the other non-discussed candidate, Google, you have no way to influence that over a certain granularity. Something is just as it is. So that means if you just have the standard layout, so the built-in ActiveSync client, and all the things that come along with that, means you have the phone application, you have the messaging, you have the address book on that iPhone using native ActiveSync, either to your on-prem exchange or to a 365 cloud mailbox. They are there side by side, right? So what that means, the interactivity in between all the applications is perfectly well. That's just the way the phone was built, and it is exactly the way the phone was meant to be used. That also means other applications, which now means WhatsApp and others, Telegram, name what you want there, and the iCloud also see the same contact base, which means if they just do something with that you cannot consent to from a legal perspective, this is a problem. Data goes into a certain place where GDPR is not enforced, which you cannot control and which you can't get back. So this is the starting point of the problem. That's important. The other thing is that the native mail application, if you use that for both business and personal belongings, is harder in terms of navigation in between accounts. I've also learned that users are not really tech savvy enough to differentiate between accounts. And so to a certain extent, it makes sense to replace that email application with a third-party email application. That's a secure mail that Citrix has created for that purpose. So that business email application allows you to present the user a dedicated business world, a different application, which has the contacts, which has the email, which obviously does not populate your technical local address book with business contacts, which would be critical in terms of exposing them to an outside world. And you manage that application through Citrix Endpoint Management, which is either the old classic on-premise and mobile, or the cloud version, which is nowadays the version to go for. And you leave aside the native ActiveSync client. You don't need that any longer. That's the core idea. What it at least has an advantage is that users, for example, can now differentiate their new messages in between personal email, which could be still active on the phone, and business email, because the message center, as just a very small, simple example, now can group these messages in between these two different applications. If it's coming from just one application, it's just one message center group. If it's two different applications, it's two groups. That's a direct benefit for that. So you have these side-by-side thing. You have business contacts and personal contacts into different, split across different apps. Not too bad per se. That's the core idea of sandboxing. And you can then get rid of native active sync, at least for the business purpose, which is kind of the goal, to get the shielding back in your phone and being safe in regards to, for example, the iCloud backup, WhatsApp, and other candidates that pitch your local address book and do something to that data. That's the key element here. So as I was saying, you can still allow personal usage of the native mail client or other third-party emailers of other players in the market space. That's actually beneficial to a majority of customers to have that separation in between apps. So it looks like a nice world. The downside obviously is now your address book is empty, or it is at least empty in terms of all your business contacts. It has all your personal addresses in there, or friends and whatever family is there. That's all good, but the business contacts reside in an isolated world. So when you get a call, it's just a number. That just looks ugly, right? It goes to the recent list, it goes to the call display. So if you want to work with that, technically, it's not a fun game. So your users will not buy into that. Looks like a small detail. Try to roll that out in an organization with 10, 100, 1,000 people. Guess what? That will last for 1 or 2 days, and then the solution is being canceled and need to rework all that stuff. That's not the way to go forward. It was a nice idea, but it doesn't work. What Citrix obviously has tried in the early phase was a setting that you control through your endpoint management as part of the policies that the MDEX framework and SecureMail has. They allow you either a full or a reduced export of the needed information, such as the name and the phone number, into the local address book, so that you have something as a copy there, which obviously brings a better interactivity to the applications, so messaging and phone and stuff like that. All that is good. The users have certain issues with working with that, because you have this as an export, not as an import version. So when you do a change to a contact, you need to make sure that it is done on the MDX tier, so that the export then comes back to the local book. If you edit the contact locally, it's just getting lost on the next sync, or it doesn't make it back into your business layers. So that's actually not that easy point. That one way is not that nice thing. What limits the solution, kind of, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is that you have a personal identifiable information, so name and number is a perfect definition of a PII. You have exported that into a world where other applications undesirably now have access to, so it doesn't work. You can't go that way. You are not compliant at the point when you enable that export contact setting, regardless if you do the full or the limited export. It doesn't work. It's not legally okay. That's the reason why it took a while that we now have a different setting inside the MDX container, specifically for Secure Mail, because Citrix now leverages an API that comes with the operating system, which is called call kit, which means the application has a method of being part of your caller ID scenario that kicks in each time you get a call. And so you have a loose coupled linkage in between an MDX application and the phone application, which starts by iOS 10 and upwards. So it shouldn't be rocket science to have that. And that way, the phone application has the ability to showcase you the number without needing a copy in the address book. So that even includes CarPlay compatibility, because it's still the same app, just moved into your car. And you get a good experience for the users. And what that was the shipping thing by September last year, which made a difference, because now the first time it was possible to deploy the application even on an unmanaged phone, and just controlling the Secure Mail application as a separate entity on a non-MDM'd device, for example. So just MAM mode, that's the terminology, and still maintaining and making sure that this contact export doesn't cause you any problem. That was the thing. It has some downsides, obviously, because the local address book remains empty. So you need to go into Secure Mail to get contacts. If you get an SMS, it just has a number and not a translated name because the messaging application is not part of the CallKit API. That's an Apple decision, not a Citrix limitation. That's an Apple decision of not extending the reach of that API to other applications than just the phone app, but that's just the way it is. So it has a difference, right? If you compare that, right-hand side will be the old traditional native client, which is then forbidden because you cannot use that any longer without making sure how other applications interact with that guy. And the left-hand side is the call kit. You see the difference in terms of the size of the font that is taken. So the display name goes into the subtitle, so the number stays in bold and the names get much smaller. Same in the reasons, it gets translated, it is somehow usable, and it is something that is worry free except for messaging. So this is, well, it's usable to a certain point, and it directly makes sure that the WhatsApp application running on the same phone has no access to a translated name, because there is no translated name in an address book. The address book is empty. That's the trick of that. So this is the way that you just can deploy that, even if you want to keep with an existing BYO strategy, for example, if you want to refrain from deploying MDM complexity and do whatever you want there. So it's technically, I would say, a usable functionality that has made a great difference for an ad hoc solution. It may be a strategic decision to have at least an easy starting point, to be in compliant and offering a minimum functionality at least. So that's I would say kind of mission solved. However, that is something that is a good story if you have the phone directly in your hand, right? But what if mobility actually means really being mobile? And the ugly thing with that picture is not only that we now need to rethink the world of mobility, that's also something that is at least important depending of where you are located, and not only in terms of a GDPR perspective, but also in a leisure perspective of driving around hands-free or not hands-free. For me, as you know, I come from Germany. If you get caught with a phone in your hands while driving, it gets hugely expensive. So it's 1/4 of your driving license being evicted. So 4 times in a row, and your driving license is revoked permanently. You have a huge fine. You have a one month pausing for driving and stuff like that. That differs per the country where you get caught. And beside of the fact that the law is not correct with that, it's also heavily dangerous not being focused on driving. So you need to think the world of hands-free driving and the options that come with the thing when you now have a different phone in your hand that no longer has an address book, right? So back to the picture, what you need to take into consideration is the way car integration is being realized for your car fleet. So if car integration means CarPlay, so the native Apple interface that directly makes the phone in your car, that's okay. It's pretty much the same experience. That's pretty good. You can pretty much deal with the contacts, kind of. That's same usable as if you would hold the phone in your hands, and you're still compliant. However, if you have a non-CarPlay approach, which means a Bluetooth pairing with your car, and you need to have something that relies on the phone book access profile, which is the standard in terms of Bluetooth pairing with your car, then that makes a difference then, because this guy is not part of CallKit. The API is directly bound to the phone application and nothing else. So it's only not only messaging that doesn't take part of that, also the PBAP that doesn't respect that, which means we need to look at that in detail. It's a usability question that comes up directly. What that means is, if Bluetooth now requires an address book to have contacts, because that's the sync point for the car, we need native contacts, right? So back to the native contacts, as iOS needs that. And any third-party application, it's only secure mail, it's any other non-Apple native client, has no chance of being an address book provider. That's not the way the iOS operating system was built. There's no way. You can't blame a vendor except for Apple themselves. There's no way. So the idea is to think if there is a way to provide complementary access to the native Sync client, which I previously said we can forget about that, and reintroduce that back into the whole play without violating any legal boundary. So the first goal is, for example, saying we stick with secure mail because of usability reasons, as I was saying, separating the native mail experience for personal mail versus business mail on the app side, message center and stuff like that. And we need to allow contacts to be there on the phone. We could switch off all the other things that come with the native client. So switching off native mail for business, switching off native calendar for business, switching off reminders, notes and stuff like that, because we don't need that necessarily, because that's all covered through secure mail. However, the contacts are important. But if we allow the contacts there, we need to make sure how that works, because if it leads to the contacts being in your address book, again, the participants like WhatsApp and others have access to that. And there's a fundamental difference in the way of how all this works in terms of what is called an unmanaged contact versus a managed contact. If you configure the ActiveSync client manually on your phone, you create an unmanaged ActiveSync peering, which obviously creates unmanaged contacts. If you, however, do an MDM ownership on the device, remember what I was saying about the end of BYO in those scenarios maybe. If you do an MDM ownership of the device and you have at least an iOS 11.3 upwards, which means everything that was made iPhone S and upwards, so typically the most relevant iOS phones that we have in our hands should be compatible to that. And we deploy the ActiveSync through an MDM provider, such as Citrix Endpoint Management. And we deploy a restriction to the phone, which is called manage documents. And all these 4 points come together as one. In that phase, those contacts become managed contacts. So all these 4 things are an and combination. Nothing may be left out for that. If they are managed contacts, they behave differently than unmanaged contacts. It's a little ugly that from a UI perspective on the settings that you deploy with an endpoint management solution, they just talk about documents, which essentially means they would like to speak about contacts as well. So you need to know that the document is meant to be a contact if it is the combination of the 4 guys on the left-hand side. Then you have something that actually is a managed contact as well. Once you have that, you have a dual option on your address book API. You have managed contacts coming through the corporate environment, residing in the native address book, and you have unmanaged contacts that you create yourself. That's your friends, your family, and all that stuff. If you look at the diagram here, it's not random that the errors have different ending points. The phone book access profile really reads and access the whole API of all contacts, whereas the applications on the phone just have access to the unmanaged contacts. Therefore, the Bluetooth peering now has reachability back to the important ones, the business contacts that you still have caller ID capability, whereas the other applications do not see those contacts any longer, which is important at that point. You see the picture, that means unmanaged contacts go into any unmanaged app. Think about that a while. If you would deploy WhatsApp as part of the MDM strategy as an assigned application to your phones because of comfort reasons, you make this a managed app. If that happens, WhatsApp would directly participate on managed contacts. So what you may not do is providing a direct download option through MDM to the phone, which means the users have to subscribe to WhatsApp themselves through the public store. Even if it is a $0 application, it may not be assigned through MDM. It must be bought or acquired, if you will, by the end user. So it remains an unmanaged application so that the boundary of unmanaged contacts makes sense. That's just an important side effect. And that at least applies to those guys of you that have iOS on a DEP train, where you typically assign all the applications to your users to have that more comfortable. This is something you may not do in that cases because you extend the boundary of managed applications otherwise. That's important. What you have with that, as everything is now available on the native application space, you have voice dialing, you have perfect messaging, you have all the small little details. The Bluetooth is fine, you have full car pairing with that. WhatsApp and the other applications do not have access to those contacts. Even an iCloud backup cannot back up those data, so it's all separated. And obviously, I need to say, if you have been running around with native sync over the last years, and obviously you will not have deployed managed contacts earlier on, it is likely that all these dangerous things like an upload to the iCloud or an upload to WhatsApp and stuff like that all has happened. So the law has been violated anyway. So the cleaning procedure, if you want to introduce that new operational paradigm to users, the cleaning procedure of wiping all those data places where an upload of contacts has happened earlier on because you did not take care about those separations, that is costly, that is time consuming. But the whole picture wouldn't make any sense if you would not do that. Just keep in mind there is some cleaning that has to be done. And unfortunately, it's pretty much manual what you need to do there. There's no way of automating those cleanup procedures perfectly. What we have with that is a choice. If we now can say we have a default configuration that uses, for example, the secure mail application with that call kit enablement and control that application policy through Citrix Endpoint MAM, we can still retain our existing BYO strategy, assuming that those users are okay with what you realize with that. And what you also could do, if you are willing to do more with the technology, and you can afford the requirement and the constraint of enforcing users that want to take part of that, coupling their devices to your MDM layer, which is, by the way, included with the licenses. It's no commercial difference. It's more a technical and strategical difference how you want to deal with those users. And you link them through MDM, and you have the capability of deploying a managed ActiveSync client and a managed setting so that these contacts are shielded. You have the best of both worlds. Obviously, you need to make sure that when you deploy ActiveSync as a policy, that you do not deploy that to any iOS version lower than 11.3, because you would then deploy ActiveSync to such an old iOS. It would be, for example, an iPhone 5C and a 5 without any character. They wouldn't create managed contacts anymore. They would create unmanaged contacts because the OS has no idea of shielding the containers. Of course, it comes with a cost, not from a licensing perspective, but it comes with a cost from an operational perspective. It's more architecture, it's more technology, it's more user support. That's why I have this picture here as a differentiation between a general audience and a VIP audience. Just as a thought, at least you have the choice of deciding in between the two worlds. Obviously, the right-hand guide has a much better user experience, whereas the left-hand guide is maybe good enough. It depends on the user audience, right? If everybody has a car fleet with CarPlay equipped, that still could be good to go. Make a choice, and maybe there is an internal procedure what people have to do to apply for those upgrade configuration. If there's a terminology in place, what people have to do, what they have to consent for, and what other may be important to get from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. It's technically doable in the same setup. Comparing these two things, just to get an idea on the CarPlay, so CarPlay only, if you have the call kit left-hand wise or the high-end solution with managed contacts, the difference is again in the screen size or in the font size of the display, right? So it's a large font versus small font. It is more relevant on the reasons. You have all the things like dial history, which is much more usable. It's still there in CallKit, but it's less easier to realize how to deal with that. The address book, obviously, with CallKit, does not contain any business contacts because it is not an address book, it's just an API. Whereas on the shielded contacts, the managed contacts, you have them all. And you obviously can do voice dialing with that. That just works from scratch. That's perfectly well. And even messages that come into your car have a display name that you can easily recognize. Same, so it's pretty much similar experience. It's way better on right hand side, but it is an expensive overhead to get to that point. However, if we switch from CarPlay to Bluetooth, the difference is like day and night. Left hand side is the call kit, and as you know, the phone book access profile does not have call kit capabilities, so it's all reduced to numbers. Whereas the right hand side uses the address book. So quickly going through that, it's numbers, numbers, numbers versus names, names, names. And on the address book, obviously it's the same. Left-hand address book doesn't have the business context, whereas the right-hand side has. This is identical, obviously, in between CarPlay and Bluetooth. The address book, obviously, in the low-end solution, is just empty in regards to your business things. So left-hand side will not have prime time anyway. I would, in open words, it's unusable. If that's the audience, they will not like the approach. So last thing before closing down, there's a little backdoor thing I would talk through. It's about the backdoors. Imagine that you have a user that has now a managed contact phone in his hand. Nobody prevents your users having a secondary phone that they use to have a manual setup for active sync. There is no way of preventing users having more than just one phone. So the diagram here doesn't say we talk about one device, it's more like two devices. But the relevance is about what happens at the address book API. If you configure a manual client on a different device, you bring your business contacts, regardless if they are prem or cloud mailboxes, you bring them back into the unmanaged world. So what you need to make sure is that users have no ability any longer of manually configuring the native ActiveSync client successfully. You need to find ways of reducing this surface attack that you have there. So you need to shut down that, which is actually interesting if you want to shut down Exchange Online. Just think about that for a while. And technically, for both the managed and the unmanaged client, it's the same endpoint. So there is no criteria, nothing easy criteria available to differentiate the good in between the bad. So a managed phone versus an unmanaged phone. That's the mission now. How to differentiate the good in between the good and the bad guys. And just as a suggestion, we have multiple options. The obvious one is available in case you are running an on-prem version of Exchange. That's there for a very long time. What you can do when your devices connect through your perimeter and they go through your ADC, or NetScaler if you will, old name, there is an option which is called Citrix Gateway Connector, which does a scheduled automatic download of all the registered devices from your Citrix Endpoint Management solution, regardless if the endpoint management is the old school on-prem or the newer cloud version. They do the download of the serials for registered phones. And when the traffic then comes through your endpoint, so the active sync hits your corporate boundary, you have a reverse proxy that can just verify the registration ID versus your database and either drop or grant access to the exchange, which means a user that has a personally owned phone, which is obviously not MDM registered, has no chance of enrolling the ActiveSync client manually. That's at least the easiest starting point that you can do there. Just working. If you don't have, if you haven't thought about that today, that's the minimum thing that you should do if you want to make sure about the number of devices with ActiveSync that just run around. And all the others that have a managed phone, they get the profile automatically downloaded and don't have to configure themselves. That's a standard thing. So moving forward, a more intelligent approach is saying, okay, if we want to shield the devices better, why not going forward into a certificate-based world where we put a certificate on each phone, and the certificate obviously equals to the persona that uses the phone. And so when we use a PKI that assigns certificate from your AD, and we use MDM to deploy a certificate to the device, and the device comes back to us to your on-prem endpoint for active sync, we do a device certificate-based or a user certificate-based authentication. It's technically the same. The device and user on an iOS is practically the same incarnation. We verify that device, and everybody that doesn't have a certificate like this has no access. And there is no way of manually bringing down a device on such a phone without really a help from internal internal stuffing. So it's all automated. It's pretty much shielded. And then you can also make sure that you query the username on the certificate and do a silent authentication to Exchange, which then also brings the benefit that the users no longer have to type a password. So when you roll out the MDM profile to the client along with the certificate, it's instantly working without the user ever having to type a password. All these two examples I gave you obviously were using an on-prem Exchange. The obvious relevant question is, what if we go into Exchange Online world? Then it is still doable. Certificate-based authentication is available even with the XO. So the same deployment methodology applies, and you can configure the XO for your organization that it requires client certificates that get a direct link to your AFS infrastructure, and then we can go there and make sure that only allowed devices can get forward with that. And even there, you get single sign-on to your mailbox in the same way. So also that applies, and that also prevents manual configuration. If you haven't seen that before, that's really a powerful solution of providing both security and a user satisfaction because of the absence of passwords for ActiveSync. And just to showcase you before we have to close down, giving you a little impression of how that looks like. I'm going there with my prepared phone. I get a call. I'm not having anything on my phone, so I'm just seeing the number, which is pretty much the undesired state, obviously, which goes back into the recent list and all the things that make that annoying, obviously. So the address book is empty, right? There's nothing there. So what we now first do is deploy Secure Mail and make Secure Mail our call kit API address book provider. So if you go there, it's also using client certificates. It doesn't nag me for any settings, any passwords. It just syncs from scratch. And it brings in my business contact as part of the built-in ActiveSync client, which is not part of the contacts now. It's just part of Secure Mail. And nothing happens, obviously. It's still a number on the recent list. What we now have to manually do is to allow the iOS to use this third-party application as a call ID provider. And right after doing that, going back into the recent list, it translates that to a name in the small font size, obviously. When I get a call, it's instantly deploying the stuff in numbers. Instead of numbers, it shows you names. So that's perfect world. Everything is fine with that. If we continue the journey of a message, as I was saying, the messages are not part of the CallKit API. That remains with numbers. There is no way around that. And as I was saying, the local address book just has private contacts. Now we switch to red, which means I'm the administrator of that endpoint management solution. And what I want to do now is I deploy certificate-based ActiveSync with managed contacts to my device. So I have a policy that switches on this restriction that I do not want documents in between managed and unmanaged apps. The slider doesn't say contacts, it says the documents, but it's actually the thing that I want to have there. I deploy a ActiveSync profile in the same way as you may know, with the only difference that I use a client certificate as part of a profile, and I do a filter that iOS 11.3 and upwards is required to get that profile. So I deploy that to my phone now. The ActiveSync automatically initializes because of the certificate. It also instantly syncs to Exchange without me having to provide a password. So the address book now gets my business contact downloaded right now while we speak. So it's automatically populated. You don't see a difference between managed and unmanaged contacts. It's just the same address book. Instantly, the SMS is translated to a name. The recent list switches back to the bold font sizes and the large letters, stuff like this. And if I get a call, I get the nice display that I'm used to in the past. But this contact is now a protected one, which means if we look at the details, I was referring that earlier on, you can disable undesired functionality. Even if it's there, it doesn't make a difference. It's all cool. But that simplifies the user interactivity a little more. So it's just the contacts that are now there. You can shut down the ongoing push mechanism in forward to a fetch because contacts don't change that frequently. So it's even not wasting battery power. It's pretty much a side-by-side thing. If you go into WhatsApp and get a message from someone that is a managed contact, it still has a number. It doesn't have a name. So it's still perfectly side by side on the same phone, but still separated. So you don't violate anything there. And that applies to any other application that wants access to your address book. And as I was saying, it's just more than one application that does so, unfortunately. And so with that, you have at least the theory, depending on how many technology you want to deploy, to be compliant and still have an option between a lightweight solution and a large one. So it can be either just a MAM mode that has CallKit with a good experience for a certain use case, or you have a MDM full-blown feature set that has any desire, that satisfies any desire that you may have. But that still is in full 100% compliance to any application that asks for address book access, which obviously all your users will consent to in the same second without thinking about that. So you don't have to worry about exposing your business data of personal identifiable information, and contacts are personal identifiable information. You don't expose them to an undesired data processing world. So you are in compliance with all the needs, and you have that side by side on the same device. You don't have to have the users run around with two different entities, so one for personal and one for business usage. It can be side by side, same thing. And this is the interesting thing here is you have the choice of having that even side by side in the same solution. And so if you have a certain general audience and some VIPs, it's all the same product, same license, same setup. You don't need any more infrastructure beyond what's shipping there, and it's all baked in. The only thing you have to do, you have to configure certain stuff and need to get familiar with all those things. And once you have that, you are pretty much good to go. And with that, I'm a little bit over the time. It's recorded anyway, so sorry for letting you wait longer for the official end. In case you are not a member and just came to the webinar because of promotions, I obviously highly recommend registering with CUGC. And what we can do, as we were saying, if you have questions, I'm getting quickly into the panel here. Let me see if I can do a bunch of them online. If that is too much, I would postpone them and give you a reply through the chat. Let me quickly go there. So here is coming a question from Javier. Thank you for asking. Caller ID is only an iOS feature. Is there any plan to integrate that in Android? This is the most anticipated question that has to come. So thanks for asking that, even without negotiating there before. The Google has its own agenda. That's the fairest answer I can give you. If you want to go get happy with Google, it actually means Android for business. Any of the other things are pretty much going out of the market space, and Android for business brings you a certain comparable experience. But as I was saying earlier on, we would really explode all the time we have today if you would go through that as well. I'm still thinking about if we have a follow-up as an Google edition of this webinar, but it's not baked yet, and it costs me really weeks of time. So right now I cannot give you a date when I would deliver that. The fairest answer is it is a different world, it's a different solution. And the comparison between iOS and Google Readiness for Business is really not the same experience. So it's harder to realize that. And with that, I would take the remaining questions offline and give you a summary as part of the recordings and the downloads. And want to say again, thank you for all attending this here. And with that, giving back to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Thorsten. That was a lot of information, and I think that was all very useful, and I really appreciate you taking the time today to present that to us. And thank you to all of our attendees for being with us today. Again, as he said, if you have any questions at all that didn't get answered, we'll get to those offline. And if you will visit mycugc.org, I have created an event thread in the forums for today's webinar. So if you want to talk about today's webinar further, you can ask more questions there. I'm just getting the link for you now. Sorry, I didn't have it for you right away. It is coming up. I'll put it in the chat for you. Here it comes. And that's a very long link, but I will also include that in the email that goes out with the recording link afterwards. So you'll get it again if you don't have a chance to get to it today. So thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you, Thorsten.
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. Have a good day.
All right, goodbye, everyone.